My parents chose my brother's party over my baby's funeral. Then I made them face the truth. So, I'm Abigail Sloan, 29, and I've got a story that's been eating away at me for years. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and if you asked anyone in my family about the Sloans, they'd probably tell you about Justin, my older brother, the golden child, the sun around which the rest of us apparently revolved. It's been like this my whole life. I'd bring home a medal from a regional debate competition, first place, mind you, and my mom, Margaret, would glance at it, smile politely, and go, "That's great, honey. Did you hear Justin got asked to lead a new project at work?" Every win I had was a footnote in his larger-than-life biography. My dad, Robert, wasn't any better. He once walked into my room while I was on a video call getting interviewed for a summer research position, and without a word, just handed me the phone with Justin on the line. "Your brother needs to talk to you." No knock. No apology. And I tried, I really did, to tell myself it wasn't intentional. That maybe they were just proud of him. But when I was 17 and gave a speech at graduation, valedictorian speech, mind you, my parents told everyone afterward how proud they were that Justin had made it out to see it. Not that I gave the speech. Not what I said. Just that Justin showed up. Even after my younger sister Emily was born, it was still all about Justin. Emily and I kind of became background characters in the ongoing Justin show. She was just a toddler when I left for college, but I saw the pattern start again with her too. She'd draw something and show it to our mom, and Margaret would pat her on the head, then pivot the conversation back to Justin's latest whatever. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I'd learned to stop hoping. I moved out right after college, got a job in nonprofit management, moved into a tiny apartment near Lakewood, dated around but never really settled. I figured if I couldn't get recognition at home, at least I could carve out my own little space somewhere else. I didn't visit much. Holidays, sometimes birthdays. But every time I walked into that house, it was like stepping into a museum of Justin's greatness. Photos of him in his college graduation gown, framed certificates from his job, trophies, plaques. Hell, even his old report cards were still pinned up on a corkboard in the kitchen. Mine, packed into a dusty bin in the attic, if they hadn't thrown them out. It came to a head last Christmas. I hadn't planned on going, but Emily asked me to come. She's 19 now, in college herself, and we've gotten closer over the last couple of years. She said it'd mean a lot to her, and I figured, sure, why not? How bad could it be? Turns out, pretty bad. I walked into the house, and, like clockwork, my mom asked me to help finish setting the table, because Justin was tired. Justin had just flown in from some seminar or whatever, and he was napping upstairs. So I set the table, carried out food, poured wine. Emily tried to help too, but our mom shooed her away, telling her to let the grown-ups handle it. Apparently, I graduated from ignored to useful. Then dinner started, and I tried to make small talk. Told them about a new community project I'd been put in charge of. Robert nodded, didn't even look up from his plate. "That's nice. Justin, didn't you have a big pitch last week?" And there it was, just like always. My voice, drowned out by the ever-present drumbeat of Justin's triumphs. I don't even remember what dessert was. I just remember sitting there, looking at everyone's faces, and realizing I could disappear and no one would notice until they needed a salad tossed or wine poured. I excused myself early, told them I had a headache. Emily walked me to the door, and I swear, the look she gave me said it all. She was still stuck in it, still being fed the same message I had been for nearly 3 decades, that she mattered, but not as much as him. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of wine, sat on the floor of my living room, and cried harder than I have in years. Not because I missed them, but because I finally admitted to myself that I'd never had their love in the way I needed. It wasn't that I didn't exist, it was that I existed only in relation to Justin, and that was never going to change. I don't go home anymore. I still talk to Emily. She comes to visit me when she's on break. She told me she confronted our parents recently, asked them why they always made everything about Justin. Apparently, Margaret got defensive, said she was being ungrateful and dramatic. Robert said, "We're just proud of your brother." Is that such a crime? No, it's not a crime, but it sure as hell leaves scars. Michael was the first person who ever made me feel like I was more than someone's supporting character. When we first started dating, I was hesitant to bring him around my family, not because I was ashamed of him, but because I knew how it would go. Margaret would smile too wide and ask about his job. Robert would offer a forced handshake and talk about Justin's latest promotion. And the moment we left, I'd get a call reminding me not to take things too seriously because, as my mom once put it, relationships are distractions if they're not leading anywhere. I didn't know how to explain to them that Michael wasn't a distraction. He was a lifeline. And then I met his family. I remember walking into their house for the first time, and it actually smelled like cinnamon. Not in a fake, air freshener kind of way, but like someone had been baking and wanted you to feel at home. His mom, Diane, pulled me into a hug like I'd already been a part of their family for years, and his dad, Frank, made a dumb joke about having to compete with Michael for my attention. It sounds silly, but that little interaction nearly made me cry. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was so normal. When I got pregnant with Emily, it was Michael's parents who came over with takeout and a stack of parenting books. Diane cried when she found out and immediately started planning a baby shower. Frank offered to help assemble the crib, which I didn't think I'd need help with until I realized just how many tiny screws and vague instructions came with it. They checked in constantly, not in an overbearing way, but in the "we actually care about how you're doing" kind of way. Diane would bring over soup when I was too nauseated to cook, and Frank started coming by every couple of weeks just to check if anything needed fixing around the house. Meanwhile, my own parents showed up exactly twice during my pregnancy. The first time was a Sunday brunch at a local restaurant, where Margaret spent half the time talking about Justin's keynote speech at some insurance conference and the other half scolding me for not registering at the right baby stores. Robert mostly scrolled through his phone, occasionally throwing in comments about how this wasn't the time to be emotionally indulgent. The second time, they dropped off a box of used baby clothes from a neighbor, still stained, no note, no call ahead. When I texted to thank them, Margaret replied with a thumbs-up emoji and said, "Hope it helps. Justin's hosting a fundraiser next week. It's been very stressful for him." Michael never said anything directly about their absence. He just stepped up in every way. He read every article he could find about labor and delivery, signed us up for prenatal classes, rubbed my back when I couldn't sleep, and built a spreadsheet for hospital bags that included things like extra chargers and change for the vending machine. At the baby shower, he stood beside me while Diane passed out pink cupcakes and his sister Lindsay handed me carefully wrapped gifts. I looked around the room and realized not a single member of my family had come. Margaret had RSVP'd no with a note about being needed at one of Justin's alumni events. Robert never even replied. I tried to laugh it off, pretended I was too overwhelmed with planning to care, but that night I sobbed into Michael's chest until I physically couldn't cry anymore. After Emily was born, Michael's parents practically moved in for a week. Diane cooked meals, kept the laundry going, and gently insisted I take naps while she sat with the baby. Frank fixed the latch on our back gate, took the dog for walks, and even learned how to heat a bottle just right so Emily didn't fuss. My parents came by once, 3 weeks later. Margaret brought a monogrammed bib with Justin's initials crossed out and Emily's stitched over top. Robert asked if we had started a college fund yet. They stayed for 20 minutes. Margaret didn't even hold Emily. When they left, Michael sat next to me on the couch, his arm around my shoulder, and didn't say anything for a long time. I think he knew there was nothing he could say that wouldn't sound like pity. So he just stayed, steady and quiet, like he always did. Later that night, he changed every diaper without being asked, rocked Emily to sleep while humming off key, and left a sticky note on my nightstand that just said, "You're doing amazing." Watching Michael with our daughter made me ache in ways I didn't know were possible. Not because I was jealous, but because I finally saw the kind of love I had missed my entire life. He made parenting feel like a team effort, not a performance. When Emily had her first cold and I panicked, he didn't roll his eyes or tell me to calm down. He sat beside me on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m. while we ran the hot water for steam, holding her and whispering, "We've got her. She's okay." I think that was the hardest part. Realizing what I had missed, what I had convinced myself I didn't need. Michael's family wasn't perfect, but they showed up. They cared, unconditionally. And for someone like me, who had spent a lifetime being overlooked and talked over, that kind of love felt both overwhelming and healing. I still struggle with it, sometimes. That internal voice that whispers, "I'm only worthy when I achieve something." That voice that sounds a lot like Margaret, asking if I've considered taking a step back from work to support Justin's charity board. But Michael helps quiet that voice. He reminds me, daily, that I am enough, that I am not invisible. And every time I watch him dance with Emily in the living room, her tiny hands curled into his shirt, I know that no matter what my parents failed to give me, I've broken the cycle. I've built something better. Emily died on a Tuesday morning in late spring, and nothing in my life has ever come close to that kind of silence. It was the kind of silence that feels alive, thick and choking and wrong. I remember waking up before Michael, something I rarely did, and just lying there for a moment listening for her soft breathing on the monitor. But there was nothing. Not a stir. Not a sigh. Just an awful, heavy quiet. I told myself not to panic. I got up calmly, walked into her nursery, still holding on to the hope that maybe the monitor had just disconnected. But when I opened the door and saw her still, pale, and cold in her crib, something inside me shattered. I screamed loud enough to wake the whole block, but I barely heard it. Michael came running in, and I think the look on his face hurt even more than the sight in front of me. He rushed to her, tried everything, even though we both knew. I called 911 with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and I could barely speak through the sobs. The paramedics confirmed it within minutes, sudden infant death syndrome. No warning, no cause, just gone. The rest of that day passed in a blur of paperwork, whispered condolences from people I didn't know, and a slow, crushing numbness that settled into my bones. Michael's parents arrived before sunset. Diane brought food I couldn't eat. Frank stood on our porch for hours, arms folded, looking like he wanted to punch the sky. They didn't try to fix it. They just sat with us in that silence, filling it with presence. I called my parents that night, even though every part of me didn't want to. I didn't want to hear how they'd twist it, how they'd somehow make it about Justin or pretend like nothing had happened. But part of me still hoped, somehow, that they'd show up, that they'd prove me wrong, that they'd be different this time. Margaret answered the phone and didn't even sound surprised. I could hear clinking glasses in the background and distant music. I told her Emily was gone, and there was this pause. Not long enough for shock, not long enough for grief. Then she said, "Oh, honey, that's awful. But babies, they come and go. You're still young. You'll have another chance." I didn't even know what to say to that. It felt like I'd been punched in the chest. I told her the funeral was set for Friday, noon at the chapel near our house. She didn't ask about details. She just said, "Well, that's unfortunate timing. Justin's engagement party is Friday afternoon. You know that. It's by the pool. Very big deal. We're hosting. It's been on the calendar for weeks." I just sat there, phone to my ear, feeling like I was floating outside my own body. "So you're not coming?" I finally asked, my voice cracking in the middle. "To your granddaughter's funeral?" She sighed, annoyed, like I was being unreasonable. "You'll have other children, Abigail. But Justin only gets engaged once. We have to support him right now. He's going to be a husband. That's a big step." And that was it. No apologies. No emotion. Just logistics. Robert didn't even bother to call. He texted Michael a thumbs-up emoji 2 days later with the words, "Thinking of you." That was the sum total of his grief. Friday came, and the chapel felt so quiet it might as well have been empty. A few friends from Michael's work came. A couple of neighbors. Diane and Frank sat beside us in the front row, their hands wrapped around ours the entire time. No Margaret. No Robert. No Justin. I found out later through one of Michael's cousins that they had posted pictures from the pool party on Facebook during the service. There was a cake shaped like a diamond ring, matching towels with Justin and his fiancée's initials, and Margaret smiling like nothing had happened. Someone tagged her in a photo captioned, "Best day ever." I left the chapel shaking, not just from the weight of what we'd just done, burying our daughter, but from something deeper, something like finality. I wasn't just grieving Emily anymore. I was grieving the idea that my family would ever be capable of love. Real love. Unconditional love. They had chosen a party over a funeral. They had chosen a son with a fiancé over a daughter who had just lost her child. Michael didn't say a word the entire ride home. I think he was afraid of what would happen if he did. When we pulled into the driveway, I got out of the car and stood there for a long time staring at the little wind chime Diane had hung on our porch. It was shaped like a star. It didn't move. No wind. No sound. Just silence. And that was when I finally understood that they were never going to show up for me. Not when I succeeded. Not when I failed. Not when I became a mother. Not when I stopped being one. They would always orbit Justin, and I would always be the afterthought. The one they forgot to invite. The one they blamed for ruining the schedule. The one who didn't matter enough to mourn with. I walked into the house, took off my shoes, and went upstairs to Emily's room. Her crib was still there. Her stuffed animals. The soft green blanket Diane had knitted. I sat on the floor and just stared at it all. Not crying. Not angry. Just empty. I don't know how long I stayed there. I just know that when Michael came up and sat beside me, he didn't ask me to move. He didn't ask me to talk. He just put his arm around me and stayed. And that silence, his silence, felt nothing like the one I'd grown up with. It didn't feel cold or indifferent. It felt safe. It felt like love. The morning of Emily's funeral started with a stillness that didn't belong. The sky was clear, the kind of pale, bright blue that made the whole world look sharper than it should have. I remember standing in front of the mirror, trying to fix my hair into something that didn't look like grief, something that wouldn't make people flinch when they looked at me. Michael was downstairs with Diane, who had already brewed a pot of coffee that neither of us touched. Frank was outside, pacing the front walk in his best suit, his face pinched the way it gets when he's trying not to cry. We arrived early. I couldn't sit at home any longer. The chapel filled up fast. My co-workers from the clinic came, every single one of them, even the front desk manager who normally never leaves her post. Former patients showed up too, people I'd helped coordinate treatment for, who remembered me even though I couldn't recall all their names. My college roommate drove 4 hours to be there. Even people I hadn't spoken to in years. High school classmates I hadn't seen since graduation. Old neighbors from my childhood street. They all came. Some of them brought flowers. Others just came quietly, took a seat, and waited. But not my parents. The front row of the chapel had a space reserved for them. 2 empty seats, perfectly aligned, directly across from the tiny white casket that was somehow real. I kept looking at those seats like if I stared long enough they would just appear. But they didn't. Michael never said a word about it. Diane squeezed my hand during the opening prayer and didn't let go. We stood, we sat, we cried through the music. I barely heard the pastor's words. The only thing I remember him saying was Emily's name, drawn out gently like he was trying to make it last. People came up and shared memories of her even though she had barely lived. Stories about her smile, her laugh, the way she held on to fingers like she never wanted to let go. And through it all, I waited. For a text. For a whisper. For something. It wasn't until we got to the cemetery that I checked my phone. Michael was helping the pallbearers lift the casket out of the hearse. I stood off to the side for just a moment, needing something to distract myself from the pit that was forming in my chest again. I didn't expect much. Maybe a message, maybe a missed call. What I got instead was a notification. Justin had just posted a photo on Instagram. Him and his fiancée, both of them holding champagne flutes in front of a sparkling blue pool. Her diamond ring caught the sun perfectly, and they were both laughing like the world was exactly as it should be. The caption read, "Couldn't be happier. #engaged life, #cheerstis." I scrolled down a bit more. Another picture. Margaret and Robert clinking glasses with them, all 4 of them in coordinated outfits. My mother's caption read, "Celebrating our favorite couple. Family first, always." I didn't realize I had dropped my phone until Diane bent down to pick it up. She didn't ask what I had seen. She just put a hand on my back and guided me toward the gravesite. The grass was freshly trimmed. The air smelled like cut stems and perfume. I walked behind the casket with Michael. The crowd followed us in silence. Every footstep felt too loud. When they began lowering Emily into the ground, something in me cracked open. I watched her disappear slowly beneath the earth while somewhere, my family was toasting Justin's future with strawberry mimosas and monogram napkins. It was the most alone I had ever felt, surrounded by dozens of people. All these faces looking at me with kindness, with sadness, with love. And yet, the 2 people who were supposed to anchor me in this world didn't think my child was worth grieving. I stood there long after everyone else had taken their place around the edge of the grave. I didn't cry. I couldn't. It felt like the part of me that knew how to grieve had gone quiet. I just watched the dirt cover the box that held the last 6 months of my life. The last 6 months that meant everything. After the final prayer, people began to drift away. Hugs were given, condolences whispered. I thanked them all. I meant it. But I kept looking back at those empty chairs at the front of the chapel, at the space beside the grave where my mother and father should have stood, and all I could think was how loud absence can be. Louder than any sob, any eulogy, any thunder. They chose champagne flutes and Instagram captions over their granddaughter's final goodbye. They chose celebration over grief. And that, more than anything else, buried the last thread I had been holding on to. 2 weeks after we buried Emily, I got a call from my mother inviting me to dinner. She said it just like that, like she was asking me to a movie or reminding me about a dentist appointment. "We're having a little family get-together on Sunday. You should come, Abigail." It's been a while. I should have said no. I should have hung up. But something in me, a flicker of habit, or maybe that small, stupid piece of hope that still believed they might try, made me say yes. Michael didn't want me to go. He didn't say it outright, but I saw it in the way he paused when I told him. In the way his jaw clenched just slightly, the way he said, "Are you sure?" Like he already knew the answer. But I told him I needed to do it. I think I needed to see it for myself, to stop imagining versions of my parents that didn't exist. Dinner was at their house, the same place I'd grown up in, the same place where every wall still had Justin's face on it in one form or another. I pulled into the driveway just as the sun was starting to go down. The porch light was already on, glowing like a trap. I stood at the front door longer than I should have, my hand hovering over the doorknob before I finally pushed it open. Inside, nothing had changed. The air smelled like the same floral candle Margaret always burned, the one I used to think smelled like home until it started to make me nauseous. Justin and his fiancée were already there, sitting at the table with wine glasses in hand. My dad was carving roast beef in the kitchen, and my mom was fluffing napkins like we were hosting royalty. They greeted me with smiles, too wide, too rehearsed. Margaret hugged me briefly, then immediately turned back to the table. "We were just talking about the wedding plans," she said, as if there was no shadow hanging over the room. "Justin's thinking of doing Tuscany. Can you imagine? Autumn in Italy. It'll be perfect." I sat down. I nodded. I sipped the wine they offered, even though it tasted like sand. They talked for over an hour about Justin's wedding, about flights and fittings and favors, about honeymoon destinations. Then they shifted to his work, some new partnership, another award. I watched them laugh and toast like nothing had happened. Like the last time I saw them wasn't at a cemetery they refused to step foot in. At some point, my mother mentioned custom stationery for the wedding invitations, and something in me cracked. I waited for a break in the chatter and said, quietly at first, I miss Emily. The table went still, not silent. Still, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see if I'd stop. I didn't. She would have loved this. I gestured to the table, the food, the stupid wine glasses shaped like tulips. She liked colors. Bright ones. I think she would have loved being part of all this. Margaret didn't look at me. She just refilled her glass and said, Abigail, let's not spoil the mood with such topics. Spoil the mood. Like mentioning my daughter's name was an act of violence. Like grief was an offense. I looked at her for a long time, trying to find even a trace of regret in her face. There was nothing. Just that same polished indifference she always wore when things got inconvenient. Robert didn't even flinch. He just wiped his mouth with a napkin and said, What happened, happened. It's done now. It's done now. My hands were shaking under the table. I could feel my pulse in my jaw, in my throat, in my temples. I stood up slowly. No one stopped me. Justin was already back on his phone, scrolling like he'd been waiting for me to finish so the room could move on. I walked to the front door without saying goodbye. I didn't slam it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just left, got into my car, started the engine, and drove away from the house where I once believed family meant something. I didn't look back. There was nothing worth seeing. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was something Michael said, or maybe it was just the quiet that had been sitting in my chest ever since that dinner. The kind of quiet that doesn't go away, the kind that festers. I woke up one morning and realized I was done waiting for them to understand on their own. They never would. Not unless I made them. So I set the date, called my parents, and told them I needed to speak with them. Not a conversation. Not a family dinner. Just a meeting. 1 hour, my place. They showed up 5 minutes early. Margaret wore one of her stiff, buttoned-up cardigans, the same kind she wore to PTA meetings when I was a kid. Robert came in looking like he'd just stepped out of a country club commercial. They didn't bring anything. No flowers. No coffee. No expression that hinted at discomfort. Just that same tight politeness they always wore when they didn't want to be somewhere. I had everything laid out on the dining table. There was a binder. Yes, a binder. I needed them to see it. Needed it to be impossible to ignore. Inside were photos of Emily, printed and slid into plastic sleeves. One per page. Smiling. Sleeping. Laughing. Michael had helped me pick them out. Beside that, I'd laid out a timeline, handwritten, of every major moment in my life that had been dismissed, minimized, or outright overshadowed. School achievements. College graduation. My first job. All of them annotated with what they said or didn't say, and what Justin had done that same week. It was exhaustive. I wanted it that way. Then came the screenshots. Instagram posts. The ones from Justin's engagement party. The ones that went up the exact hour we were lowering Emily's casket into the ground. Hashtags. Champagne. Post smiles. The picture where Margaret was laughing with a drink in her hand. I printed it in color. I wanted her to see the brightness of her dress against the dimness of that day. Lastly, I placed the letter. I didn't look at them when I handed it over. I just said, I'm going to read something, and you're going to sit and listen. You're not going to interrupt. You're not going to correct me. You're just going to listen. They nodded. Margaret folded her hands. Robert adjusted in his chair like he was preparing for a meeting. I started reading. I read about being 8 years old and hearing them call Justin the one with real potential when they thought I was asleep. I read about the day I got accepted to college and Margaret's first response was, Did Justin help with your application? I read about the silence after my wedding, how they RSVP'd late and left early. I read about the night I came home from the hospital with Emily and they never showed up. I read about that morning, the Tuesday she died, how they hadn't even called. I read about the chapel, the 2 empty seats. About Margaret's words, just a baby. About Robert's, what happened, happened. At some point during the letter, I heard Margaret's breath hitch. When I looked up, her eyes were glassy. One tear slid down her cheek, slow and careful, like even her grief had to be measured. Robert stayed still, but his jaw clenched. He looked at the photos, the binder, then back at me. He said, We didn't know. We didn't realize it was this deep. I didn't let him finish. You didn't want to know? I said. You've had years to notice. You just chose not to. I pointed at the photos. This is your granddaughter. The one you didn't bother to say goodbye to. This is the life you chose to ignore. And that party, those pictures, those weren't accidents. That was a decision. Margaret didn't speak. Her hand moved to her chest like she needed to feel her own heartbeat to stay grounded. Robert finally leaned forward, elbows on the table, and said, "We thought you were stronger than this. We thought you didn't need the same attention Justin did. He always struggled more." I stared at him. "And what did I get for being strong?" I asked. Silence. Absence. "You were supposed to be there. Not just for Emily. For me. But you weren't. Not once. Not really." They didn't respond. Margaret looked down at her lap. Robert sat back again, quiet now. I closed the binder, pushed it toward them. "Take it. Read it. Or don't. I don't care anymore. But you're not going to rewrite the story. This is what happened. This is who you've been." They stayed for another 10 minutes, mostly in silence. Margaret wiped her face twice. Robert looked around the room like it made him uncomfortable. Then they left. No hugs. No apologies. Just silence. But for the first time in my life, it was my silence. My voice had filled the room, and they had no choice but to sit in it. It was a plain envelope, the kind that usually holds bills or dull correspondence, with my name written in my father's careful, almost mechanical handwriting. No return address, no decoration, just my name and our home address centered like it had taken him an hour to write it. I almost didn't open it. It sat on the kitchen counter for a full day while I debated whether I even wanted to read whatever excuses they had left. But eventually, I poured a cup of tea I didn't drink, sat at the table, and slit the top with a knife. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no date. Just a few paragraphs written in blue ink, every line perfectly aligned like he'd ruled the page by hand first. He wrote that he'd spent the last few weeks thinking more than he had in years. That when I showed them those photos, the binder, the letter, he felt something shift in a place he didn't know was still capable of moving. He said he had failed me. Not once, not in a moment of anger or weakness, but again and again, for decades. That he had watched me disappear behind Justin's shadow and convinced himself I didn't mind because I didn't complain. That he thought I was strong enough to not need them, and used that belief to justify every moment of absence. And then, near the bottom, came a line I never expected to see. "I was wrong. I know it now. And I am sorry." I sat at that table holding the letter for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. It didn't fix anything, but it settled something. Like finding the end of a frayed rope and tying it off just to stop it from unraveling further. A few days later, a package arrived. No card, no warning. Inside was one of Emily's favorite toys, a soft, well-loved plush rabbit with a slightly crooked ear. But it wasn't hers. It was new. Still had the tag on. Tucked beside it was a small note, written on one of Margaret's stiff stationery cards, the kind she used for birthdays and thank you messages. The handwriting was tight and slanted, the way it always had been. I should have been there. I regret it for the rest of my life. No name. No apology. Just that sentence. I ran my thumb over the ink like it might smudge, like it might dissolve under my touch and disappear. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't try. Then, one afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Not loud, not urgent. Just 3 even taps. I opened it to find Justin standing on the porch holding a potted rose bush and a shovel. He didn't ask to come in. He just said, "I wanted to plant this for her. If that's okay." I stepped aside, and he walked around the side of the house without another word. Michael was inside, but he stayed put. It was my moment to handle. Justin planted the rose bush in the corner of our backyard, near the tree where Emily's wind chime still hung. He didn't talk much. Just worked the soil, laid the roots carefully, covered them like he was tucking in a child. When he finished, he brushed the dirt off his hands and looked at me. "I didn't get it before," he said. "Not really. But I do now. I should have been there." I nodded. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say it was okay. I just stood with him as the wind picked up and the chime above us rang softly in the breeze. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. A beginning that didn't erase the ending, but acknowledged it. The rose bush hasn't bloomed yet. It's still just green and raw and waiting. But I go out every morning and check it, just to make sure it's still there. Just to remind myself that even after all that silence, something finally took root. Grief doesn't fade. It reshapes. After Emily died, I thought I'd live the rest of my life carrying this raw, unbearable thing that would always sit just beneath my skin. And in some ways, that's still true. But what I've learned, slowly, painfully, and without any epiphanies, is that you don't have to bury that grief. You can carry it. You can build around it. A few months after the funeral, I started volunteering with a local support group for parents who'd lost infants. At first, I just sat in the back, listening. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to open myself up to anyone else's pain when my own felt so loud already. But then one night, a woman across the room began describing what it felt like to walk past a nursery that no longer belonged to anyone. Her voice cracked mid-sentence, and for the first time in weeks, I spoke. I didn't plan to. It just came out. I told her I knew exactly what that silence sounded like. And when she looked at me with those red, exhausted eyes and nodded, I realized I wasn't alone. From there, something started to shift. I began showing up regularly, helping organize meetings, making coffee, writing notes to people who couldn't make it. I met fathers who hadn't said their child's name out loud since the funeral, mothers who blamed themselves even when every doctor had told them it wasn't their fault. I started to understand that the worst part of losing a child isn't just the loss itself. It's the silence that follows. The way the world keeps turning like nothing happened. So I made sure people said Emily's name. I turned the room that would have been her playroom into a memorial space. Soft lights, a small table with her photos, her footprints framed on the wall, a bookshelf with candles, guest books, and cards. People would come over, friends, neighbors, even former patients, and we'd sit there together sometimes without saying anything. Other times we'd talk about her, what little there was to remember, but it was enough. Her memory filled the space the way her laughter would have. My family started to respect that space. They didn't show up uninvited. They didn't fill the air with their own needs. They came when asked. They listened. Even Margaret, who once wouldn't let me mention Emily's name at dinner, stood in that room one afternoon and placed a tiny ceramic angel on the shelf. She didn't say anything, but she stayed. I didn't forgive them. Not in the way people like to imagine forgiveness happens. This wasn't about redemption arcs or second chances tied up in tidy bows. This was about truth, about drawing a line in the ground and saying, this is what happened, this is how it felt, and this is what it cost. It was about refusing to let them rewrite the story into something easier for them to live with. Because even the smallest life deserves respect. Emily only lived 6 months, but she mattered. She mattered to me, to Michael, to Diane and Frank. And now, somehow, through the work I do, she matters to other grieving parents who never got to hear someone say, your baby mattered too. This isn't the life I planned, but it's the one I'm building. One conversation, one gathering, one fragile rose bush at a time.